Hello and welcome to This Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here today because we're tackling one of the most fascinating, complex, and honestly multi-layered stories in modern history, the story of Indian independence. You know, when we think of Indian nationalism, it's so easy to just picture a single, unified wave of people marching side by side toward freedom. But the reality? Well, it was incredibly diverse. It was like a giant puzzle, a massive mosaic of different social groups, conflicting demands, and vastly varied experiences that all somehow had to be stitched together.
So this is the ultimate question we're exploring today. How do you actually unite a massive, deeply divided subcontinent to overthrow an empire? It's a staggering challenge. This movement wasn't a monolith at all. It was a really fragile coalition built out of the extreme hardships that followed World War I. India was dealing with forced soldier recruitment, massive tax hikes, crop failures, and a deadly influenza outbreak all at once. The suffering was just immense, and the people were desperate for a way forward.
Okay, let's dive right into this roadmap. Today, we're going to walk through the three major waves of resistance and explore some really crucial thematic deep dives. We'll start with the spark of Satyagraha. Look at the non-cooperation movement. March through the famous SALT campaign. Examine the fractured visions of freedom, see how a collective identity was forged, and finally, look at the final push for independence. Let's get started.
Section 1. The Spark of Satyagraha.
To really wrap our heads around this, we've got to set the stage. It's post-World War I. The British promised things would get better for India after the war, but, spoiler alert, they didn't. Instead, they introduced the Rowlatt Act in 1919, which essentially allowed them to suppress political activities and literally lock people up without a trial. The atmosphere was incredibly tense. To give us some temporal anchors, we are unpacking a decades-long struggle today. It starts with Mahatma Gandhi returning to India from South Africa in 1915. It escalates with those Rowlatt Act protests in 1919, moves right into the massive non-cooperation movement of the 1920s, builds up to the Salt March in 1930, and reaches its climax with the Quit India movement in 1942. Keep these milestones in mind as we navigate the story.
So what exactly was this new method of fighting back? Well, it was satyagraha. It's the concept of fighting injustice through truth and nonviolence, entirely without using physical force. Gandhi brought this idea back with him in 1915, and he tested it out in local areas first with some really great success. In 1917, he helped peasants in Champaran and Kedah fight against unfair tax systems. And in 1918, he organized a successful satyagraha for cotton mill workers in Ahmedabad. He was proving, on the ground, that nonviolence could actually work.
Now, what's really interesting about this next point is a revolutionary argument Gandhi made in his book Hind Swaraj. He said British rule in India depended on Indian cooperation. It sounds simple, right? But it was a massive shift in mindset. Gandhi argued that the British Empire was only functioning in India because Indians were actively allowing it to, by participating in its institutions. This radical idea formed the absolute backbone of what would eventually become the massive non-cooperation movement of 1920.
Section 2. Non-cooperation and its limits.
The trigger for this massive movement was, quite frankly, horrifying. In 1919, British forces commanded by General Dyer massacred hundreds of unarmed protesters at Jallianwala Bagh. The resulting anger was just unprecedented. Gandhi realized that to launch a broader movement, he desperately needed to unite the two major religious communities, Hindus and Muslims. He did this by combining the Indian demand for self-rule with the Khilafat issue, which was a campaign to defend the Ottoman Khalifa, something very important to Indian Muslims. Together, they marched for Swaraj. But, and here is a big yes, but transition for us. Yes, millions of people joined the movement wanting Swaraj, but they all had completely different definitions of what that actually meant. Swaraj literally means self-rule, but a wealthy business owner and a poor peasant looked at that exact same word and saw two totally different futures.
This divide is brilliantly illustrated right here. In the cities, the urban middle class enthusiastically boycotted foreign goods and British schools. But eventually, this peaceful movement slowed down because producing Indian khadi cloth was just too expensive compared to mass-produced British textiles. Now contrast that with the rural tribals in the Gudam Hills. Their leader, Alluri Sitaram Raju, deeply respected Gandhi. But to achieve Swaraj, he didn't use peaceful boycotts. He actually led an armed guerrilla warfare campaign against British forest policies. You can see how the movement was fracturing along geographic and class lines.
I absolutely love this micro-narrative because it shows exactly how local groups interpreted national movements through their own immediate needs. Look at the Assam plantation workers. For them, Swaraj didn't mean some abstract political independence. They thought Gandhi's movement literally meant they were legally free to just pack up, walk off the plantations, and get land in their home villages. When they tried to leave, they were met with harsh police beatings. It just shows how incredibly difficult it is to control a decentralized movement.
Section 3. The Salt March. Ultimately, due to rising violence, Gandhi actually called off the non-cooperation movement in 1922. The rest of the 1920s saw economic depression and massive protests against the all-British Simon Commission, which, amazingly, didn't include a single Indian member. And that brings us to 1930. 240. That is the number of miles Gandhi decided to walk from his ashram in Sabarmati to the coastal town of Dandi. Why? Because of salt. The British had a strict monopoly on salt production and charged a heavy tax on it. Gandhi realized that salt, a basic necessity used by the rich and the poor alike, was the absolute perfect unifying symbol to expose the everyday oppression of British rule.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because the strategy to turn this into a nationwide phenomenon was brilliant in its simplicity. Step 1. Send a letter of demands to Viceroy Irwin, warning him of action. Irwin, of course, refused to negotiate. Step 2. Gandhi and 78 volunteers start walking those 240 miles, and they're gathering thousands of supporters along the way. Step 3. Arrive at Dandi, boil some seawater, and physically break the salt law. This single act officially kicked off the civil disobedience campaign, leading to mass boycotts, protests, and the eventual arrest of thousands of leaders, including Gandhi himself.
Section 4. Fractured Visions of Freedom. Because as we're learning, getting everyone to march is one thing. Getting everyone to agree on the end goal is an entirely different story.
See, the Indian National Congress was trying to balance a very tricky tightrope here. Rich peasants suffering from the global depression joined the movement hoping Swaraj meant lowering agricultural taxes. Poor peasants, however, wanted their unpaid rent to landlords forgiven. If the Congress supported the poor peasants, they'd alienate the rich ones. Meanwhile, you had business owners funding the movement hoping it would end colonial trade restrictions, but they grew super worried when younger members of the movement started leaning towards socialism. It was just a constant balancing act of conflicting economic demands.
Beyond the economics, there were profound social fractures, particularly regarding the Dalits, or oppressed castes. Both leaders here wanted to uplift the community, but their strategies were entirely different. Gandhi believed Swaraj was impossible without ending untouchability, and he wanted to integrate Dalits into society through general elections. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, however, believed social integration just wasn't enough. He demanded hard political solutions, specifically reserved seats in separate electorates to ensure elite representation. This disagreement was intense, culminating in Gandhi undertaking a fast unto death, which ultimately led to the 1932 Pune Pact, granting reserved seats but through general elections.
Section 5. Forging a collective identity. So, how do you actually build a united nation from all these deep fractures?
Nationalists used an array of cultural tools to build a shared psychological identity. Visualizing the nation as Bharat Mata, or Mother India, painted beautifully by artists like Abanindranath Tagore, gave people a literal figure to revere. Leaders like Rabindranath Tagore drove a massive revival of traditional Indian folklore and songs. They designed symbols, like the Swadeshi tricolor and Gandhi's Swaraj flag, giving crowds a physical banner to rally behind. And importantly, Indian historians began reinterpreting past achievements in science, art, and math to instill pride and directly challenge the British narrative that Indians were backward.
So the crucial point is that while these tools successfully built pride, they had a major unintended consequence. Because so much of the imagery, the folklore, and the historical focus relied really heavily on Hindu traditions and Hindu history, it alienated non-Hindu communities. Political negotiations over representation had already failed, and this Hindu-centric cultural revival deepened the wedge, fostering distrust and resulting in limited participation from many Muslims in the later civil disobedience movements.
Section 6. The Final Push.
By 1942, the globe is entirely engulfed in World War II. After the British failed to negotiate Indian support through the Cripps mission, the atmosphere in India turns to outright desperation. The breaking point is reached in August. Gandhi steps up and issues his famous "do or die" speech in Bombay. He isn't asking for gradual self-rule or minor tax breaks anymore. He launches the Quit India movement with a single, uncompromising demand: an immediate British exit from India. The response is electric, and massive unrest erupts across the entire subcontinent.
Naturally, the British respond with incredibly brutal suppression, locking up the entire Congress leadership almost instantly. But the movement just continues to rage. Students, workers, and peasants united in a way they never quite had before. New underground leaders emerged, like Jayaprakash Narayan, and we saw incredibly strong female participation, with figures like Matangini Hazra leading processions despite facing British bullets. It took the British over a year to suppress the protests. It proved, once and for all, that despite all the fragmentations we've discussed today, the people of India had finally forged an absolutely unstoppable collective force.
We've seen how the fight for Indian independence was never just a simple story of one people fighting one enemy. It was a massive, complicated effort to unify a subcontinent buzzing with different needs, classes, and dreams. Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. Can a truly unified nation be built from a foundation of such deeply conflicting voices and fractured demands? It's a question that resonates not just in history, but in democracies all around the world today. Thank you so much for learning with me today on this explainer. Catch you on the next one.